When Marcus Sullivan lost his six-figure executive job at Henderson and Coincidental, the walls of his penthouse apartment seemed to close in around him, but nothing prepared him for what came next. His wife Rachel, the woman who'd promised to stand by him through sickness and health, served him divorce papers exactly 48 hours after his termination, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on their marble kitchen counter as she explained that she deserved better than a failure. 3 months later, an ivory envelope arrived at his cramped studio apartment, embossed with gold lettering that made his stomach turn. Rachel cordially invited him to witness her wedding to his best friend, David Chen, the same man who'd smiled at Marcus's retirement party while secretly orchestrating his corporate downfall. Marcus stared at that invitation for 3 days, rage and humiliation burning through his veins like acid, until he noticed Elena, their former maid, the quiet woman with kind eyes who'd been let go when Rachel decided she was cutting unnecessary expenses. But Elena wasn't standing at his door asking for her job back. She was standing there in a navy blue suit, holding a briefcase, explaining that the small cleaning business she'd started had just secured a contract with the city's largest hotel chain, making her a self-made millionaire virtually overnight. The chemistry between them had always existed, simmering beneath the surface of professional boundaries, and now, freed from the constraints of employer and employee, something shifted in the air between them. When Marcus showed Elena the wedding invitation, her response was simple: let's show them what they threw away. But how does a man who lost everything transform into someone who arrives at his ex-wife's wedding in a Rolls-Royce, with the former maid now his stunning new wife? What happened in those months between the divorce papers and the wedding day that changed not just Marcus's fortune, but his entire understanding of loyalty, love, and what it means to truly value another person? And when Rachel sees Elena step out of that Rolls-Royce in a dress that costs more than the wedding itself, what truth will finally shatter the illusion she'd built about who deserved what in this world? Marcus Sullivan remembered the exact moment his life fractured into before and after. The mahogany conference room on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a view he'd earned through 15 years of 80-hour weeks and sacrificed weekends. His boss, Gerald Henderson, hadn't even had the decency to look him in the eye. Just slid the termination papers across the polished table like they were discussing quarterly reports, not dismantling a man's entire identity. Corporate restructuring, they called it, a cleaner way of saying David had whispered the right poison into the right ears, planting seeds of doubt about Marcus's judgment on the Thornton merger, the same merger David had sabotaged from the inside. Marcus had trusted David completely, had championed him for promotion, had stood as best man at his first wedding, and that trust had been the knife David twisted deepest. Walking out of that building with his belongings in a cardboard box felt like a public execution. Former colleagues averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their computer screens or documents that absolutely required their immediate attention. The security guard who'd greeted him every morning for a decade couldn't meet his gaze as he escorted Marcus to the street. The September air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back, and Marcus stood on the sidewalk watching the revolving doors spin, delivering people into careers he no longer had access to. His phone buzzed incessantly, text from Rachel that grew increasingly frantic. "What happened? Call me now. People are talking." Not once did she ask if he was okay. Not once did she offer support. She wanted information, damage control, a story she could spin to her country club friends to minimize the embarrassment of having a husband who'd been fired. The penthouse apartment they'd purchased 3 years ago suddenly felt like a museum dedicated to excess. Marble countertops imported from Italy. Designer furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Rachel's walk-in closet, the size of a studio apartment, filled with clothes that still had tags dangling from sleeves. She'd been spending, always spending, as if his salary was an infinite resource, as if she was trying to fill some void inside her with Louis Vuitton and Gucci. Marcus had ignored it, chalked it up to her needing to maintain appearances, told himself that keeping her happy was part of being a good husband. What a fool he'd been. Rachel arrived home at 7, her heels clicking against the travertine floors like a countdown to detonation. She was beautiful in that carefully constructed way. Blonde highlights that required monthly maintenance, skin that glowed from expensive facials, body sculpted by a personal trainer she saw 4 times a week. They'd met at a charity gala 9 years ago, and Marcus had been dazzled by her confidence, the way she commanded a room, how people seemed to orbit around her natural charisma. He'd mistaken her social ambition for drive, her materialism for appreciation of quality, her constant need for validation as passion. Looking at her now, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, designer bag dangling from her wrist, he saw a stranger. "This is unacceptable, Marcus," she said, not even bothering with hello or how are you. She set her bag on the counter with more force than necessary. "Do you have any idea what Stephanie said to me at tennis today?" She practically smirked when she asked if the rumors about Henderson were true. I had to pretend I knew what she was talking about. "You humiliated me." The words hit him like physical blows. Not concern, not support, humiliation. He tried to explain about David, about the sabotage, about how he'd been set up, but Rachel's eyes had already glazed over with disinterest. She didn't care about the truth. She cared about perception, about status, about what this meant for her position in their social circle. The conversation spiraled quickly from there, accusations flying like shrapnel. She called him a failure, said she'd wasted the best years of her life on him, demanded to know how he planned to maintain their lifestyle. When Marcus suggested they might need to downsize, cut back on expenses, maybe sell the penthouse, Rachel looked at him like he'd suggested they move into a cardboard box. "I'm not living like some middle-class nobody," she hissed. The contempt in her voice was breathtaking. "I deserve better than this. Better than you." 2 days later, the divorce papers arrived via courier. Rachel had already moved into David's place, the efficiency of her departure suggesting she'd been planning this long before Marcus lost his job. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, a legal euphemism that did nothing to capture the devastation of watching your life partner abandon ship the moment the waters got rough. Marcus signed them in a fog, barely reading the terms. He didn't care about fighting for the penthouse or the cars or the investment portfolio. Let her have it all. He just wanted it to be over. Elena Vasquez had worked for them for 3 years, arriving every Tuesday and Friday to clean the penthouse with quiet efficiency. She was 32, originally from Colombia, with dark hair she always wore pulled back and eyes that seemed to notice everything. Rachel had treated her like furniture, barking orders without looking up from her phone, leaving passive-aggressive notes about missed spots or improperly folded towels. Marcus had always made a point of greeting her, asking about her daughter Sophia, the 7-year-old who sometimes appeared in Elena's stories about school plays and soccer games. There was something about Elena's presence that felt like calm water in the chaos of his marriage. She moved through the apartment with purpose and grace, never complained, always had a kind word even when Rachel was particularly demanding. 3 weeks after Rachel left, Marcus came home to find Elena in the living room, her cleaning supplies packed, a resignation letter on the kitchen counter. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan," she said, her accent giving the words a musical quality. "Mrs. Sullivan called me. She said my services are no longer needed, that this is no longer her responsibility." Her eyes were apologetic, as if she felt guilty for leaving him too, as if she was part of the wave of abandonment that had defined his recent existence. Marcus wanted to tell her to stay, that he'd pay her himself, but the truth was he couldn't afford it. The severance from Henderson would last a few months if he was careful, but Elena's twice-weekly rate was a luxury he no longer possessed. "I understand," Marcus said, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. "Thank you for everything, Elena. You were always kind, and I appreciated that." She smiled at him then, really smiled, and it was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "You were always kind too, Mr. Sullivan. I'm sorry about everything that happened. You deserve better." The sincerity in her voice made something crack in his chest. Here was this woman who'd been treated as invisible help, offering him more compassion than his wife had managed in weeks. She handed him her new business card. Simple, white with embossed lettering. "If you ever need anything," she said softly. A reference, a friend, Someone to talk to. Please call. The studio apartment Marcus moved into was a shoebox compared to the penthouse, located in a neighborhood that Rachel would have crossed the street to avoid. 400 square feet that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cooking and had a radiator that clanked like chains dragging across metal. But it was his, paid for with money he'd squirreled away in a private account Rachel hadn't known about. And there was something freeing about living in a space that required no pretense. He bought a futon off Craigslist, ate ramen and canned soup, spent his days sending out resumes that disappeared into digital voids, and his nights staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of his marriage, trying to identify where it had all gone wrong. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Thick cardstock, gold embossing, Rachel's elegant script inviting him to witness her marriage to David Chen. The audacity of it stole his breath. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a victory lap, a final humiliation designed to prove she'd won. Marcus could picture her at the country club, telling her friends with manufactured sadness that she'd invited her ex-husband because she believed in taking the high road, in showing that she harbored no ill will. The women would coo about her grace while secretly delighting in the drama. David would smile his snake smile, having successfully stolen his best friend's wife, job, and dignity all in one clean sweep. For 3 days, that invitation sat on Marcus's counter like a bomb waiting to detonate. He'd pick it up, read it again, feel the rage build in his chest until he thought he might explode, then set it down and try to distract himself with job applications or television static. The wedding was in 6 weeks. Black tie, reception at the Grandview Plaza, the most expensive venue in the city. The kind of place Marcus and Rachel had discussed for anniversary parties they'd never gotten around to planning. He imagined walking in alone, the pitying looks, the whispered comments, Rachel's triumphant smile as she clung to David's arm, finally with a man who could provide the lifestyle she deserved. On the 4th day, Elena knocked on his door. She was different from how he remembered. Her hair was down, falling in waves past her shoulders, and she wore a navy blue suit that looked expensive, tailored perfectly to her frame. She carried a leather briefcase and had an air of confidence that seemed new, or perhaps had always been there but hidden beneath the uniform of a maid. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, and then corrected herself. "Marcus, I hope it's okay that I came by. I got your address from the forwarding information." Marcus invited her in, suddenly acutely aware of how pathetic his studio must look. The futon that doubled as bed and couch, the mini fridge humming in the corner, the single pot and pan drying by the sink. But Elena didn't look around with judgment. She sat on the futon, set her briefcase down, and looked at him with those kind eyes that seemed to see past all his defenses. "I wanted to tell you in person," she said. "My cleaning business, the one I started after leaving your home, it's grown faster than I ever imagined." She explained how she'd taken every dollar she'd saved from years of working multiple jobs, combined it with a small business loan, and started pristine services with 3 employees. The concept was simple: eco-friendly cleaning products, employees who were paid fair wages and treated with respect, personalized service for each client. Word had spread quickly through the city's professional networks. Within 2 months, she had 20 employees. Within 3, she'd secured a contract with the Grandview Plaza hotel chain to manage housekeeping for all 5 of their properties. The contract was worth millions. Elena Vasquez, the woman Rachel had dismissed as merely help, was now a self-made millionaire. "I never thanked you properly," Elena said, her voice soft but firm. "When I worked for you and Mrs. Sullivan, you were the only one who saw me as a person. You asked about my daughter, remembered her name, treated me with respect. That might not seem like much, but it meant everything. It reminded me that I was worth more than how I was being treated." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I heard about the wedding, about the invitation." Marcus felt his face flush with shame. How did she know? Had it made the social circuit, become gossip fodder? Elena must have seen the embarrassment in his eyes because she reached out, placed her hand on his arm. "David Chen's assistant is married to one of my employees. Word travels. Marcus, I've spent the last 3 months thinking about you, wondering if you were okay, wanting to reach out but not knowing if it was appropriate. She took a breath. I'm not going to pretend there wasn't always something between us. I felt it when I worked for you, but there were boundaries, lines that couldn't be crossed. You were married, you were my employer. But those lines don't exist anymore. The air in the small studio seemed to shift, charged with possibility and truth. Marcus had felt it too, those moments when Elena would hand him a cup of coffee and their fingers would brush, when he'd find her arranging flowers in a vase with such care that it seemed like meditation, when she'd smile at something he said and the world would feel less heavy. He'd buried those feelings under guilt and obligation, told himself he was imagining things, that he was just lonely in his marriage and projecting onto someone who showed him kindness. But Elena was right. The attraction had been real, mutual, simmering beneath the surface of propriety. I have a proposition, Elena said, and now there was something fierce in her expression, a determination that made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards. Let's show them what they threw away, both of us. You were brilliant at Henderson, everyone said so, and you were pushed out by a man who couldn't compete with your integrity. I was treated as invisible help when I was actually someone building an empire from the ground up. We both know what it's like to be underestimated, dismissed, thrown away when we were no longer convenient. She pulled the invitation from his counter, where it had been sitting like an accusation. Come with me to this wedding, not as her ex-husband showing up alone and pathetic, but as my partner. Let Rachel and David see that they didn't break you, that you found something real while she was chasing status symbols. Elena's eyes were blazing now. I'm not suggesting we fake this for revenge, Marcus. I'm saying we explore what's actually been growing between us, and we do it honestly. But if announcing it at their wedding makes them choke on their champagne, well, that's just a bonus. The next 6 weeks felt like falling and flying at the same time. Elena introduced Marcus to her world of business contracts and expansion plans, and he found himself energized in ways he hadn't been in years. She needed help, she explained. Pristine Services was growing faster than she could manage alone, and she needed someone with his experience to help structure the company for sustainable growth. Marcus threw himself into the work with desperate focus, helping Elena set up proper accounting systems, negotiating better rates with suppliers, developing a training program for new employees. It felt good to be useful again, to have his skills valued, to work alongside someone who saw him as an equal partner rather than a status symbol or a paycheck. But it was more than just business. They'd have dinner at her small house in the suburbs, where her daughter Sophia would tell elaborate stories about her school day, acting out different characters with dramatic flair. Marcus would help with homework while Elena cooked, and there'd be these moments, her laughing at something Sophia said, the way she'd push her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, how she'd touch his shoulder when she walked past. That made him realize this was what he'd been missing. Not the penthouse or the expensive cars or the country club membership. This warmth, this authenticity, this sense of being part of something real rather than performing in an elaborate stage production called a successful life. They'd stay up late after Sophia went to bed, talking about everything and nothing. Elena told him about coming to America at 22, with nothing but a suitcase and determination, working 3 jobs while taking night classes to improve her English, the fear when she got pregnant by a man who disappeared the moment she told him, the fierce love she felt for her daughter that made every sacrifice worth it. Marcus talked about growing up middle class in Ohio, the pressure to prove himself worthy of the opportunities he'd been given, how he'd confused achievement with happiness until they became so tangled he couldn't tell them apart. Rachel wanted the idea of success, he said one night, wine making him honest. She fell in love with what I represented, not who I was. I don't think she ever really knew me. I see you, Elena said simply, and the way she looked at him made something long dormant in Marcus's chest unfold like a flower opening to sunlight. Their first kiss happened in her kitchen on a Wednesday night, dishes still in the sink, Sophia asleep upstairs. It was tender and tentative, both of them aware they were crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, but it felt inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The chemistry that had simmered beneath propriety now had permission to burn, and it transformed everything. They were careful around Sophia, not wanting to confuse her until they were sure. But when it was just the two of them, Marcus felt like he'd been holding his breath for years and could finally exhale. 3 weeks before the wedding, Elena proposed. Not a fake arrangement for show, but a real marriage, a commitment to build a life together. "I know it's fast," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she held his. "But I've spent 3 years watching you from a distance, Marcus. I know how you treat people when no one's looking. I know your character. And these past weeks have just confirmed what I already suspected. You're the partner I want for business and for life. Sophia adores you. I'm falling in love with you. If I'm being honest, and I think you feel the same way." Marcus did feel the same way. The realization had crept up on him gradually and then all at once. Elena represented everything real that had been missing from his life. Authenticity, kindness, partnership based on mutual respect rather than transactional exchanges. He said yes, and they went to the courthouse 2 days later, Sophia as their witness. The whole ceremony taking 15 minutes but feeling more meaningful than the elaborate production of his first wedding. They bought rings from a vintage jewelry store, simple gold bands that Elena refused to let Marcus split the cost of because she reminded him with a grin, a millionaire now. The Rolls-Royce was Elena's idea. "We're not going to slink in like we have something to be ashamed of," she declared. "We're going to arrive like the successful people we are, and they're going to have to reckon with the fact that they threw away something valuable." She found a Phantom in midnight blue through a business contact, the kind of car that turns heads and demands attention. Marcus balked at the extravagance until Elena pointed out that they were making a statement, and statements required bold gestures. "Besides," she said with a wicked smile, "it would be fun." The morning of the wedding, Marcus woke in Elena's bed, their bed now, with sunlight streaming through the windows and his wife's arm draped across his chest. Wife. The word still felt new and strange and wonderful. Elena stirred, opened her eyes, and smiled at him with such unguarded affection that Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Ready to face the dragons?" she asked. And he nodded, because with her beside him, he felt ready for anything. Elena wore a dress that made Marcus forget how to breathe. Emerald green silk that clung to her curves and made her skin glow. Designer shoes that cost more than his monthly rent. Her hair styled in elegant waves. She looked like old Hollywood glamour, sophisticated and stunning. But it was the confidence radiating from her that truly transformed her appearance. This wasn't the quiet maid who cleaned their floors. This was Elena Vasquez, CEO, wife, a woman who'd built an empire from nothing and wasn't apologizing for her success. Marcus wore a Tom Ford tuxedo Elena had insisted on buying, and for the first time in months, he looked in the mirror and recognized himself. Not the broken man who'd lost everything, but someone who'd shed the weight of pretense and found something genuine. The Rolls-Royce glided through the city streets like a shark through water, powerful and impossible to ignore. The driver Elena had hired maintained perfect professionalism, but Marcus could see his slight smirk in the rearview mirror. Clearly, he'd been briefed on the situation and was enjoying being part of the dramatic reveal. As they pulled up to the Grandview Plaza, Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The venue was exactly as ostentatious as he'd expected, with massive columns and manicured gardens and a literal red carpet leading to the entrance. Wedding guests in their formal attire clustered in groups, champagne glasses already in hand, the kind of people who attended events to be seen rather than to celebrate. The Rolls-Royce stopped directly in front of the main entrance, blocking the view of anyone trying to ignore their arrival. The driver opened Elena's door first, and she stepped out like a queen claiming her throne, pausing to let the moment breathe, letting everyone get a good long look at her. Marcus could see the confusion on faces in the crowd, people trying to place her, whispers starting to ripple through the assembled guests. Then Marcus stepped out, and the confusion transformed into shock. He could identify the exact moment people recognized him, watch their expressions cycle through surprise to disbelief to scandalized delight. This was gossip gold, an ex-husband showing up to his former wife's wedding, and not alone, not broken, but arriving in a Rolls-Royce with a woman who looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. Marcus took Elena's hand, and they walked up that red carpet together, heads high, moving with the confidence of people who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Well, maybe a little something to prove. The massive doors to the venue opened, revealing a ballroom decorated within an inch of its life. White roses by the thousands, crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, a string quartet playing something classical and pretentious. Rachel's aesthetic screamed desperately expensive, every detail chosen to impress rather than to create beauty. It felt like a wedding designed by committee, focus grouped for maximum social media impact. They found their seats. Rachel had seated him at table 12, far from the action, probably hoping he'd slink in unnoticed and leave early. Instead, Marcus and Elena sat down with regal composure, Elena smoothing her dress with deliberate care, making sure anyone watching got a good look at the ring on her finger. The other guests at their table were people Marcus vaguely recognized from Rachel's social circle, minor players who'd always treated him with the careful politeness reserved for people they needed, but didn't particularly like. Now they were staring openly, confusion and curiosity etched on their faces. "Marcus Sullivan," one woman said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry to neighboring tables. "I hardly recognized you, and who is your lovely companion?" Before Marcus could respond, Elena extended her hand with practiced grace. "Elena Sullivan," she said, letting the surname land like a bomb. "Marcus's wife. So wonderful to meet Rachel's friends. I've heard so much about all of you." The sweet venom in her voice was magnificent, polite enough to pass as friendly, while making it absolutely clear she knew exactly what these people had said about Marcus, exactly how they treated him. The woman's face went through several complicated expressions before settling on a frozen smile. "How lovely," she managed. "I wasn't aware Marcus had remarried. How long have you two been together?" "We've known each other for years," Elena said, which was technically true. "But we only recently had the freedom to explore our connection. Funny how life works out, isn't it? Sometimes losing the wrong person helps you find the right one." She squeezed Marcus's hand, and the gesture was so genuinely affectionate that even these professional gossips could see this wasn't an act. The ceremony was scheduled to start in 15 minutes, but the arrival of Marcus and Elena had thrown gasoline on the carefully controlled atmosphere. People kept finding excuses to walk past their table, craning their necks to get a better look, whispering behind hands and champagne flutes. Marcus could track the progress of the gossip spreading through the room like watching dominoes fall. He saw Stephanie, Rachel's tennis partner, pull out her phone and start typing frantically, probably texting Rachel, who was somewhere getting ready, to warn her about the unexpected development. "You okay?" Elena asked quietly, leaning close so only he could hear. There was concern in her eyes, genuine worry that this might be too much for him, that facing Rachel and David might reopen wounds that were still healing. Marcus looked at his wife, his actual wife, the woman who'd seen him at his lowest and helped him rebuild, who treated him like a partner rather than an accessory, and felt something settle in his chest. "I'm better than okay," he said honestly. "For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The string quartet shifted into the wedding march, and everyone turned to watch the bridal procession. Rachel appeared at the back of the ballroom, and Marcus had to admit she looked stunning. She'd always been beautiful, had always known how to present herself for maximum impact. Her dress was a confection of lace and crystals, probably cost $50,000, her makeup flawless, her smile radiating the kind of joy that would photograph beautifully. But watching her walk down the aisle, Marcus felt nothing. No residual love, no bitter regret, just a kind of distant observation, like watching a stranger perform in a play. Rachel's eyes scanned the crowd with practiced grace, accepting the admiring stares as her due, until her gaze landed on table 12. Marcus watched her process what she was seeing. Him, Marcus, her failed ex-husband, who was supposed to show up alone and miserable, sitting there in a custom tuxedo next to a woman who radiated success and beauty. Rachel's step faltered, just for a second, her smile freezing before she forced it back into place. But Marcus had seen it, that moment of shock and something else. Fear, maybe, or the first crack in her carefully constructed narrative about how she'd upgraded from a failure to a winner. David stood at the altar, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the audience, his smile smug and self-satisfied. He was handsome in that generic way of men who peaked in their 20s and spent their 30s desperately trying to maintain that image. 2 white teeth, expensive haircut, suit that probably cost more than it should. Marcus looked at his former best friend and felt pity rather than anger. This was a man so insecure he had to destroy someone else to feel powerful, so empty he had to steal another man's wife to feel desired. Rachel and David deserved each other, Marcus realized. They were both hollow people trying to fill voids with status and possessions, and they'd spend their marriage competing over who could acquire more impressive things to prove their worth. The ceremony was mercifully short. The officiant, who clearly didn't know the couple, well delivering generic platitudes about love and commitment. Rachel and David exchanging vows that sounded like they'd been copied from a wedding website. No one cried. No one seemed moved. It was a performance, a production, the wedding equivalent of a press release announcing a corporate merger. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was polite but restrained, the kind of clapping you do because it's expected rather than because you're genuinely happy. The reception moved into the adjoining ballroom, even more elaborate than the ceremony space. A 12-piece band instead of a string quartet, tables laden with food that looked beautiful but probably tasted average, a bar with top-shelf liquor and bartenders doing elaborate cocktail tricks. Rachel and David made their entrance to applause and camera flashes, taking their places at the sweetheart table elevated on a platform so everyone had to look up at them. Symbolic, Marcus thought. Rachel always needed to be above everyone else. Marcus and Elena moved through the reception with strategic precision, accepting congratulations from people who were clearly trying to get more information about their relationship. Elena was a natural charming these social climbers with the same grace she used in business negotiations, dropping casual references to pristine services and the hotel contracts that made eyes widen with respect. Marcus watched her work the room and felt proud, not of possessing her, but of being chosen by her, of being someone she thought was worth standing beside. They were at the bar ordering drinks when David appeared, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand like they were old friends meeting at a casual gathering, rather than enemies at a wedding that symbolized his betrayal. "Didn't think you'd actually come. Brave of you." The condescension dripped from every word, the assumption that Marcus was here to suffer, to bear witness to his own inadequacy. Marcus shook David's hand because refusing would have given him power, would have shown that David still had the ability to affect him. "Wouldn't have missed it," Marcus said calmly. "Elena and I needed a date night, and you were kind enough to provide dinner and entertainment." He turned to Elena, placing a hand on the small of her back with casual intimacy. "Elena, this is David Chen, my former colleague. David, my wife, Elena Sullivan, CEO of Pristine Services." The introduction landed exactly as intended. Marcus watched David's expression cycle through confusion to recognition to something like fear. David had heard of Pristine Services. Everyone in business circles had heard about the meteoric rise of the cleaning company that revolutionized the hospitality industry. But he hadn't connected Elena, the CEO, with Elena, the maid who used to clean his best friend's penthouse. The realization hit him visibly, color draining from his face as he processed the implications. "Your wife?" David stammered, all his smooth confidence evaporating. "But didn't she used to work as a maid?" Elena finished for him, her smile sharp as a blade. "Yes, I did. I worked for Marcus and Rachel for 3 years, learning valuable lessons about business and human nature. It's amazing what people reveal when they think you're invisible, when they treat you as furniture rather than a person with eyes and ears and ambition." She accepted her drink from the bartender, took a delicate sip. "I should thank Rachel, really. Getting fired from that job freed me to focus on building my company full-time. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing, isn't it, Marcus?" Marcus raised his glass in agreement, enjoying the way David's jaw clenched with impotent rage. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Marcus was supposed to show up alone and beaten, a testament to David's superiority, proof that the better man had won. Instead, Marcus had arrived with a woman who was more successful than either David or Rachel, who looked at him with genuine affection rather than calculated interest, who represented everything they'd both underestimated and dismissed. "Where is your beautiful bride?" Elena asked, her tone perfectly innocent. "I'd love to congratulate her personally." Before David could respond, Rachel materialized beside him, having clearly been watching their interaction from across the room. Up close, Marcus could see the tightness around her eyes, the way her smile looked painted on rather than genuine. She'd seen them arrive, had spent the last hour trying to reconcile the image of broken, jobless Marcus with the confident man in the Tom Ford tuxedo standing before her. "Marcus," Rachel said, her voice artificially bright, "how thoughtful of you to come. And you brought a date." The dismissiveness in the word date was intentional, an attempt to minimize Elena's importance, to reduce her to a placeholder, a body Marcus had grabbed to avoid showing up alone. "Not a date," Marcus corrected mildly. "My wife, Elena. We married 3 weeks ago." He paused, letting that information detonate. "You remember Elena, don't you, Rachel? She used to work for us, until you fired her as part of your cost-cutting measures." Rachel's face went through a spectacular range of emotions: shock, disbelief, horror, rage, before settling on a mask of frozen politeness. She was trapped, Marcus realized. Making a scene would ruin her perfect wedding, but accepting this gracefully was torture. Her eyes darted between Marcus and Elena, trying to find the angle, the trick, the logical explanation for how her former maid was now standing before her, dripping in designer clothes and confidence. "How unexpected," Rachel managed, the words sounding strangled. "I had no idea you two had even stayed in touch." "We reconnected after you left," Elena said, her smile warm and genuine, which somehow made it more cutting. Marcus was going through a difficult time, dealing with betrayal from people he trusted. "I understood what that felt like. We helped each other heal, realized we had more in common than we thought, and here we are." She held up her hand, letting the wedding ring catch the light. "Funny how life works out. You were worried about cutting unnecessary expenses, and it turned out I was the most valuable thing in that apartment." The impact of Elena's words rippled across Rachel's face. This was her worst nightmare. Being shown up by someone she'd considered beneath her, having her judgment questioned, her choices thrown back in her face. Worse, people were watching. The guests who drifted closer to observe this confrontation were eating it up. The scandal of it all, the delicious reversal of fortune. Rachel had built her social position on being envied, on having the best of everything, and now she was being publicly compared to a maid and coming up short. "I think it's wonderful that you found each other," Rachel said, her voice tight with barely suppressed fury. "Marcus always did have a tendency to settle for less than he deserved. I hope you'll both be very happy in your modest life together." The insult was meant to wound, to put them back in their place, to reassert Rachel's superiority. But Marcus just laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that clearly wasn't the reaction Rachel expected. "Modest," he repeated, glancing at Elena with affection. "Elena's company is worth more than everything you and David have combined. She employs 200 people, just secured a contract with the Grandview chain, yes, this hotel, and has expansion plans that will triple her revenue in the next year. But you're right, she's modest about her success. She doesn't need to broadcast her wealth to validate her worth." The final word landed like a slap. Worth. The thing Rachel had always measured in possessions and appearances, the currency she'd built her life around, accumulating. David had gone rigid beside her, clearly doing mental math about Elena's net worth, probably realizing that the woman he'd dismissed as mere help was significantly wealthier than he was. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and everyone in that circle could feel it. "We should let you get back to your guests," Elena said graciously, taking Marcus's arm. "Thank you so much for the invitation, Rachel. It was generous of you to want to share your special day with Marcus, especially after everything. That shows real character." The words were kind, but the subtext was clear. They both knew this invitation was meant to humiliate, and it had backfired spectacularly. As Marcus and Elena walked away, Marcus could feel eyes following them across the ballroom. The gossip would be spectacular, would spread through their social circles like wildfire. But Marcus found he didn't care about the opinions of people who'd abandoned him the moment he lost his job, who'd measured his value by his title rather than his character. These people Rachel and David had surrounded themselves with were vultures, circling whoever seemed to be winning, ready to turn on anyone who showed weakness. It was exhausting, Marcus realized, maintaining relationships based on competition rather than genuine connection. They left early, having made their point and having no interest in watching Rachel and David's first dance or cutting their elaborate cake. The Rolls-Royce was waiting, and as they settled into the leather seats, Marcus felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. It was done. He'd faced the people who'd betrayed him, shown them he'd survived and thrived, and most importantly, proven to himself that he was free of them. "You okay?" Elena asked, the same question from earlier, but with different weight now that the confrontation was over. Marcus considered the question seriously. Was he okay? He'd lost his job, his marriage, his home, his best friend, everything he'd thought defined his life. But he'd gained Elena, gained Sophia, gained a partnership in a business that excited him, gained the freedom to build a life based on authenticity rather than appearance. He'd lost everything, and in losing it, had found himself. "I'm better than okay," Marcus said, pulling Elena close. "I'm finally awake." The Rolls-Royce pulled away from the Grandview Plaza, leaving behind the fairy lights and the forced laughter and the people performing happiness for an audience. Inside the car, Marcus and Elena sat in comfortable silence, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Two people who'd been underestimated and discarded finally recognizing their worth in each other. They were going home to Sophia, to their modest house in the suburbs, to a life that didn't require an audience to have meaning. As the city lights blurred past the window, Marcus thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, the executive so focused on climbing that he'd forgotten why he was climbing at all. The husband so busy providing that he'd failed to notice his marriage was transactional. The friend who'd been so trusting he'd missed all the signs of betrayal. That man was gone, burned away by loss and humiliation, and in his place was someone Marcus actually recognized, actually respected. Someone who knew that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the quality of your relationships, that success wasn't about titles but about making something meaningful, that love wasn't about what someone could provide, but about who they were when everything else was stripped away. Elena stirred against him, smiled up at him with those eyes that had seen him at his worst and chosen him anyway. "Thank you for today," she said softly, "for being brave enough to face them, for standing beside me, for showing them that they didn't break us." "Thank you for saving me," Marcus replied, and meant it with everything he had. "For seeing something in me worth saving, for giving me a reason to rebuild, for making me believe I deserve better than what I had." They kissed long and slow, not caring that the driver could probably see them in the rearview mirror, not caring about anything except this moment, this connection, this life they were building together. Outside, the city continued its endless cycle of ambition and competition, people scrambling for success defined by others, measuring themselves against arbitrary standards of achievement. But inside the Rolls-Royce, Marcus and Elena had found something more valuable than any promotion or social status or country club membership. They'd found each other and in doing so, had found themselves. When they got home, Sophia was still awake, having convinced her babysitter that special occasions warranted staying up past bedtime. She launched herself at them, demanding to know everything about the fancy party, asking if Marcus's mean ex-wife had been nice or if Elena had gotten to wear her pretty dress. They told her an edited version, focusing on the fancy venue and the elaborate decorations, the ice sculptures and the 12-piece band, leaving out the confrontation and the drama. Later, after Sophia was finally asleep and Marcus and Elena were alone in their bedroom, Elena asked him if he regretted any of it. The lost job, the failed marriage, the months of uncertainty and struggle. Marcus thought about the question, really considered it. If he could go back and change things, prevent David's betrayal or salvage his marriage to Rachel, would he? "No," he said firmly, "because all of that led me here, to you, to this life. I was successful before, But I wasn't happy. I was married, but I wasn't loved. Not really. I had everything I thought I wanted, and it was empty. This, he gestured around their modest bedroom, at Elena in her nightgown with her hair down, at the life they were building together. This is real. This matters. I wouldn't trade this for anything. Elena kissed him then, and they made love with the kind of tenderness and passion that comes from genuine connection rather than obligation. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Marcus thought about Rachel and David, probably finishing up their wedding night in some expensive hotel suite, performing intimacy the same way they'd performed the ceremony, all surface, no depth. They'd wake up tomorrow to a marriage built on status and betrayal, to a life of constant competition and one-upmanship, always looking over their shoulders to see who was gaining on them. Marcus and Elena would wake up to Sophia's laughter, to coffee and breakfast chaos, to the messy, beautiful reality of building something meaningful. They'd work together on growing pristine services, make plans for the future, navigate the challenges of blending their lives and their dreams. It wouldn't always be easy. Real life never was, but it would be authentic, and that made all the difference. As sleep pulled him under, Marcus's last thought was one of gratitude. He'd lost his job, his wife had divorced him, and she'd invited him to her wedding with his best friend to witness his humiliation. But he'd arrived with their former maid as his new wife in a Rolls-Royce. Not because he needed revenge, but because he'd finally understood what real success looked like. And it looked like Elena sleeping peacefully beside him, like Sophia's artwork on the refrigerator, like a life measured in moments of genuine connection rather than accumulated possessions. He'd lost everything that didn't matter, and in the wreckage, he'd found everything that did.